Okay, so for lesson 1 here in the chemistry unit, and if I can have, you could just turn off the front light switch for me so it's easier to see these. Thank you. Okay, alchemy and atomic models. So we're going to review a little bit here about the structure of the atom. Okay, you did a bit of that in Science 10, so we'll talk about that today and probably a bit tomorrow. The first little bit of chemistry is going to be review and then expansion on what you learned last year. Okay, so what we want to do is understand how theories about the structure of the atom were developed, okay, and we want to learn the parts of the atom and their characteristics. Okay, again, a lot of that's probably going to be a review for you. Just so you know, this is basically what your lessons will look like. Okay, when I start a lesson, there's going to be key points. Okay, those key points are the things you should be highlighting or making notes beside or whatever. Okay, as we're going through the lesson. So when you have the notes package, it's probably not a bad idea to be underlining or highlighting if you prefer the highlighter. Okay, as we go along and making jot notes in the margins or on another sheet of paper, and then kind of stapling those together. Okay. Okay, so science, the science of chemistry, came from something called alchemy. Okay, alchemy was the attempt to manipulate matter. Okay, one of the big things that alchemists tried to do was turn cheap materials into valuable materials. They wanted to transmute things like lead into things like gold. All right. Now it's impossible to do that. We know that now. Okay. But that's what the alchemists were trying to do, or they were trying to come up with the elixir of life that would grant people eternal life and things like that. They were trying to do things that are virtually impossible. But along the way, they learned a lot of things about the behavior and the structure of matter, and those things were then later used to develop essentially the science of chemistry. The problem with alchemy was there wasn't any communication between alchemists. They didn't want to give away their secrets. Okay, not like real scientists who are always communicating their stuff and publishing papers and trying to get together on ideas about how things work. Okay, so alchemy was quite a bit different, and they had their own like mad scientist-looking labs that they worked in, and potions and stuff like that, steaming tubes of stuff, and that's kind of the your stereotypical like wizard's lair kind of stuff, okay, that you would envision. Okay, so long before the science of chemistry existed, though, people applied chemistry all the time. Okay, and we still do today. They didn't know why it worked. It worked. Okay, they knew that if they cured meat with salt and things like that, that it wouldn't spoil as quickly. Okay. Things, mold and bacteria wouldn't grow on it. They could tan leather. They could do things with chemicals. They just didn't know why those chemicals did those things. Okay, so, and unfortunately for us, a lot of our discoveries were by that kind of method. Physics the same way. Okay, we used energy without understanding what it was for centuries before we got an understanding. Okay, the earliest atomist, that is the person who thought about atoms being real things, was the Greek philosopher Democritus. Okay. So he was a philosopher, he was a thinker. Being a thinker was the best job you could have in ancient Greece. Okay, you imagine guys like Aristotle and Plato, and you got to sit in the Parthenon and people would wave palm fronds and feed you grapes, and you just had to come up with ideas. Okay, it's a pretty sweet gig to have. His idea was that all matter was made of these tiny, indivisible particles called atoms. Indivisible, not invisible. Okay, they're just so small that you couldn't break them apart. Okay, they would be the smallest unit of everything that existed. His idea was not widely accepted, right? Because the Greeks, especially guys like Aristotle, said, no. All matter is made of 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. Okay, and that made way more sense. Okay, they didn't have to imagine tiny particles floating around everywhere. Okay, they knew, well, when I combine fire and water, I get steam, and so steam is some parts fire and some parts water, and they had like this whole like kind of periodic table, if you will, of how every material on Earth was some mixture of the 4 elements. Okay, lava would be some parts earth and some parts fire, and actually even some parts water because it could flow like water, okay, and things like that. So they had ideas about how those four elements made up everything, and that was way more practical. It wasn't necessarily right, but it was practical and was something they understood. So his idea didn't get accepted at the time. Okay, 2,000 years later, okay, it was revived, but at the time, everyone's like, nah, Democritus, that's crazy. Think of something else. He did. It wasn't all bad for Democritus. He came up with democracy. Okay, so he did have some good ideas. Okay, not just his atom thing didn't catch on, but in the end, it was also right. So, okay, he came up with lots of good ideas. Okay, and then we talked about alchemy here. This would be an alchemist's kind of lair, right? With all kinds of gadgets and mortars and pestles and tubes and flasks and whatever, okay, for them to do all of their stuff in. Okay, but again, their quest or their goal was to do things that are physically impossible. Right? You cannot turn lead into gold. Their atoms are different. Okay? You cannot turn one element into another element. Okay? But they thought they could because they saw when they mixed some things together that they changed. Okay? If they mixed, salt and water, the salt disappeared. So, and so they felt, oh, well, that's changed. Or they mixed two things together that were clear, and the end result was something that was yellow. Right? So they saw that when they mixed things together, there were changes, and that what they had was different than what they had before. But they didn't understand the difference between this thing is a compound and this thing is a compound, and so you got like 4 different things here, as opposed to this is an element and I can't make it any simpler, I can't change it. Okay, so they didn't really understand the difference at the time. Okay, we do now, but obviously at the time they didn't. All right, so after alchemy, kind of the Dark Ages, okay, Roger Bacon and Antoine Lavoisier essentially came up with the scientific method. Okay, and the scientific method is the thing that you see and use every time you do a lab. Okay, you got a problem or a question that you're investigating. You have a hypothesis. Okay, you come up with a procedure and the required materials. Okay, you do analysis of the data. You draw a conclusion. Okay, that was their idea, was to make science more scientific as opposed to trial and error, because that's what alchemy was. Okay, alchemy was totally trial and error. Well, I mixed those two things together and it didn't turn into gold. Well, the heck with that. Let's try something else. Okay, and it was very much a lot of that. So this made chemistry a much more methodical kind of an endeavor. Okay, and turned it into a true science. Okay, so the idea of the atom. Okay, atoms of every element are different. Okay, if you take smaller and smaller amounts of a material, eventually you would get down to a single atom of that material. Can you see that? Absolutely not. Okay, our most powerful microscopes are barely able to resolve very large atoms. Okay, because some atoms are small and some atoms are very, very large. Okay, give you an idea, hydrogen is the smallest of all the elements. Okay, it has the smallest atom. Its atom contains 1 proton and 1 electron. Okay, whereas if we're looking down here, okay, near the bottom of the periodic table, it's something like, let's say, uranium. Okay, uranium has 92 protons. It's got 140 some or 150 neutrons, okay, and 92 electrons. It is a much bigger atom. All right, so atoms are different because they contain different amounts of protons, neutrons, electrons, etc. Okay. Each atom, though, has the same physical properties. Same number of protons, same number of electrons, okay, same melting point, same boiling point, okay, all of that kind of stuff. All of them are identical. There's no way to tell, okay, the atoms of something apart. Okay, so the atom then, this is in bold-faced print here because it's important, okay. The atom, okay, is the smallest particle of an element that retains the properties of that element. Okay? If I was to split that atom, then obviously it would no longer be, okay, that element anymore. Okay? So if I took, let's say, a helium atom and I split it in half, okay, I'd have a heavy hydrogen atom and a regular hydrogen atom after that. Okay? I would also have kaboom. Okay, no, not really. If you split one atom, you'd never notice that. Okay, but yeah, it would release some energy as well. Okay, because you're changing the matter at that point. Okay, essentially that doesn't happen really in nature. Okay, to a small extent it does. With radioactive materials, they're always losing particles. That's why they're radioactive and they turn into other things. Okay, but most atoms are stable and that doesn't happen. Okay, questions so far? Okay, don't be afraid to ask if you got a question. Put your hand up. Okay, late 1700s, okay, chemists were able to relate the changes they saw when they mixed things together to the behavior of small particles, okay, that would be responsible for that behavior. Okay, and that kind of revived poor Democritus's idea of how matter was structured. Okay, the guy who put that on paper's name was John Dalton, and that's how things work in science. You get credit for it if you're the first person to put it on paper. Okay, first person to publish it, then it's yours. So Dalton devised the atomic theory. Okay, the atomic theory is made up of 4 points that for some reason are still there. I'll use different examples if we get that far. I think we might run out of time anyway. Okay, so the first thing, we've already talked about it. The atom, all elements are composed of tiny, indivisible particles called atoms. Okay, meaning that I can't get any smaller than that and still retain the properties of that material. Okay, so I would definitely know, okay, all of these points here. These are the kind of things that could end up as a multiple choice question, like which of the following is not part of Dalton's atomic theory, or which one of these statements would Dalton agree with, or something like that, right? Could be a good multiple choice type question. Second point, atoms of the same element are identical. Okay, the atoms of any one element are different, that's kind of redundant, okay, are different from those of any other element. So oxygen atoms all look alike, but they look different than carbon atoms. Okay, that's why we have different materials and different elements. It's because their atoms are different. Okay, if we're looking at those 2 atoms, for example, okay, carbon atoms all have 6 protons, oxygen atoms all have 8. Okay, and so that's why they're different. Okay, the physical properties of that material is based on the number of protons in the nucleus of that atom. Okay, third thing, atoms of different elements can combine with one another in simple whole number ratios, okay, to form compounds. And this whole number ratios part is important. It means you never have a molecule that contains half or 3/4 of an atom. Okay, they can only go together in whole numbers. Okay? So for example, with water, okay, water has 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. Okay, we don't reduce that down, okay, to 1 hydrogen and half an oxygen, okay, because you can't have half an oxygen atom. It wouldn't be oxygen anymore. It would be beryllium or something, okay, whatever number 4 is, right? So it's not the same, okay? They're always in whole number ratios. Okay, and the fourth thing, chemical reactions occur when atoms are separated. Okay, so if I was looking at water and I pulled the hydrogens and the oxygen apart, okay, not that you would do that. You can. It's how you make rocket fuel. Okay, you pull those apart. Okay, I've separated those atoms. Okay, they can be joined. I could put sodium and chlorine together and make salt. Okay, or rearranged. Maybe I have a reaction where several compounds are reacting, and at the end I've got several different compounds. Okay, I'm not changing the atoms. I'm changing who they're with. All right, I'm rearranging them, but I do not change the atoms. That's where the alchemists were always going to fail. There was nothing they could do that would change lead into gold. Okay? I can't change what I have in terms of the elements because I can't change their atoms, but I can change the compounds I have in a chemical reaction. All right? So basically, this statement says elements are not changed in a chemical reaction. Okay? Compounds can change, things like that, but the actual materials you started with don't change. All right? One that happens all the time that we use every day, okay, would be this reaction. That's the chemical reaction that fuels your car. Octane, the active ingredient in gasoline, reacting with oxygen gas. Okay? When your car burns gas, it produces two things, carbon dioxide and water vapor. All right? Over here, I started with carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And over here, I have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. I don't have any new elements. Okay? The reaction didn't produce new elements. It produced new mixtures, new compounds. All right, we'll talk about some more of that stuff tomorrow. Remember to have the notes package ready.